Well, welcome to the sixth and final posting in this very informal and brief series of postings on questions raised by the new atheism. Again, my name is Alister McGrath, and it's been my privilege to be able to talk to you on these occasions. And I thought we'd end by asking, where does the new atheism go from here? It arrived on the scene in 2006 full of energy, commitment. It was new, it was exciting. The future, many declared, was bright. Religion wouldn't survive the shock of the new atheism. So where are we now? Well, it just doesn't look anything like that now. For a start, its freshness has worn off. Its breezy slogans now seem stale and weary. In fact, they've almost become like dogmas in their own right. They seem now to be attention-grabbing overstatements which were crafted and calculated to ensure predictable media attention. The real problem, I think, is that sound bites that once seemed fresh and exciting have just become dull and plodding, and more than that, they just don't match up with reality. Where once they were thought to be simple, they're now just seen as simplistic. But I think much more worryingly for the new atheism, its ideas have now been subjected to detailed and withering critique by other secular writers. I mean, religious writers had a lot to say, but in my view, some of the best critiques have actually come from other secularists who are just alarmed at the superficiality and the aggressiveness and the dogmatism of the new atheism. God just hasn't gone away. The conversation is keeping going, and it's going in directions that I don't think the new atheism is entirely happy with. So, what's gone wrong? That's a big question I explore in my book, Why God Won't Go Away. And you can read the arguments and check out the scholarship there if you want to. But put simply, the problem is the new atheism is just what we call here in England a one-trick pony. It's got one slogan, religion is evil, and then once you kind of move away from that, there isn't really very much else to say. Beyond that, it seems to have little to say other than its predictable rants against religious belief and religious people. And as I read atheist blogs, they now have agonized reflections on why the movement has failed to gain the intellectual high ground in Western culture. They just haven't been able to deliver the knockout blow against God. God is still here. In fact, with the new interest in religious questions generated by the new atheism, he's here in a bigger way than before. And furthermore, to the intense irritation of new atheist apologists, their Christian opponents regularly appeal to reason, to science, to experience very effectively in critiquing the new atheism. And it's not easy to have your own weapons used against you. Society at large just hasn't bought into its analysis of the pathological role of religion. And paradoxically, instead of thanking the new atheism for enlightening everybody about the dangers of religion, most people are complaining about the movement's intellectual shallowness or its dogmatism or its sheer intolerance. Yet it's not simply, I think, the intellectual and evidential weaknesses of the movement that have been exposed by its clamour for attention. I think there's a realisation that atheism is existentially deficient. And that's a point which I think has caused real concern, both within the atheist movement, but also in parts of the new atheism itself. For example, many new atheists are very alarmed at Sam Harris's well-known view that while religion is bad, spirituality is good. Where does that come from? This has generated a lot of concern within the new atheist community. Some are dropping dark and ominous hints of Sam Harris's unsoundness. For example, the Indian writer Meera Nandi, who was a Hindu before her deconversion to atheism, argues that Harris just illustrates a disturbing trend in the new atheism, a tendency towards credulity. Some atheists, she suggests, start believing in anything after they give up believing in God. And for Nanda, Harris's interest in spirituality shows that he's a covert religious believer, hiding behind a smokescreen of rationalism and science. Here's what she says. The mystical beliefs of which Harris approves are every bit as unscientific, untestable, and unverifiable as the religious belief he so aggressively attacks. The real point here, I think, is that Nanda's analysis points to the spiritual vacuum felt by so many new atheists. And like Harris, they seek to fill this with spiritual beliefs and practices which are just as irrational as the religious beliefs and practices of which they are so critical. And anyway, how do you justify this distinction between religion and spirituality? It's just not that simple, you know. The real issue here is that the new atheism creates a void. You have to fill it with something. Harris fills it with Eastern mysticism. What do others fill it with? As I point out in my new book, Why God Won't Go Away, the new atheism does seem to be running on empty. Having fired off its rather predictable anti-religious salvos, it does seem to have rather little else to offer, and merely repeats formulaic criticisms of faith when people are clearly looking for something that matters, that satisfies, that works. And many are finding that the new atheism just doesn't do that. The new atheist community seems to think that public ridicule of their opponents is a substitute for evidence-based argument. But I'm afraid it's wearing thin and it's losing its novelty value. I see many new atheists beginning to realize that maybe those arguments that seemed so simple back in 2006 might actually just be simplistic. For the rest of us, the emperor's new clothes now seem decidedly skimpy and outdated, and it's time to move on. But let me end, if I may, with a story. I was in London and I had just given a lecture on the rationality of faith. And a young man came up to me afterwards and asked me if I'd sign a copy of my textbook, Christian Theology, an Introduction. Now, I was very happy to do that. But I asked him, what led him to study theology in the first place. Here's what he told me. He'd read Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, a year or so earlier. And it seemed so unfair and one-sided, he felt he needed to hear the other side. So he started going to church. After a while, he found he just couldn't sustain his faith in the parody when confronted with the real thing. He converted to Christianity. And he told me, without Dawkins, I would never have given God a second thought. And that's what's happened because of the new atheism. God's back on the agenda. There is huge interest in this question. And people are not drawing the conclusions the new atheism wanted them to. But back to my young man. As I signed his book, he told me he had a theological question for me. Here's what the question was. Since the God delusion had been so instrumental in his conversion, he asked me, should he thank God for Richard Dawkins in his prayers? I'm still thinking about that one. Thank you so much for listening. It's been great fun. Bye-bye now.